2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And we're talking this morning with Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Joes. Jim, hello and welcome. Listening to that
morning,
song,
Meryl.
Do you think Tony Abbott might have been looking for love in all the wrong places?
Well, it's possible. He certainly didn't find it when he needed it.
No, Scott Morrison's stoushed with him over the radio, and, you know, then Tony Abbott this morning coming out saying, well, he didn't give me any warning whatsoever. Scott Morrison said that he tried to get a message to the Prime Minister's office. That all seems a little bit Chinese whispery to me.
Yes, and it's all a little, sort of last week, if you like, because Tony Abbott sort of said, look, I'm not going to engage in any of this argy-bargy now that I've lost the leadership. I'm going to step back and keep my mouth shut, etc. Well, he didn't last not quite a week, really, and he's already engaging in it. So I think probably the party made the right decision, the Liberal Party, that is, made the right decision.
Well, the polls are indicating that. 2 polls in the last couple of days giving the coalition a bump, the first bump in 18 months. Yes,
I think that they can at the moment think that they're heading in the right direction. They've certainly consolidated, shall we say, and 2 polls in a row, admittedly within a week of each other, so it's not like that there's a big gap here. But the other poll we should just quickly touch on, Meryl, is Canning.
Yes.
A by-election traditionally goes against the government. There's usually a swing, and there wasn't a uniform swing in Canning, because if you look at different parts of Canning, the swing varied. And in the sort of, shall we say, the more Liberal-prone areas of Canning, the swing was pretty low, around 3%, thereabouts. It grew, the swing was bigger in the sort of more urban, shall we say, more working-class areas of Canning. It was around 10%, depending on which booth you looked at. And it sort of, that in itself suggests that all is not necessarily going to be plain sailing come a federal election, and I think it will give Malcolm Turnbull a bit of pause for thought here, because if you look at the areas where the swing was greatest in Canning, those areas have a very similar demographic to some of the depressed areas or the areas which are struggling in, say, areas of Western Sydney.
Yes, they're comparable, in other words.
Northwest of Melbourne, and all of those sorts of places which are struggling under the sort of economic changes. They're not likely to be easily won over just simply because the Liberal Party's changed leader.
I want to get to Malcolm Turnbull's strategy and what you think is the best way forward, and your suspicions on how he might go in just a moment. But I think the point also needs to be made, Jim, that both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard enjoyed similar bumps in those polls in the very close weeks after they were promoted. So I think that it's certainly very positive news for Malcolm Turnbull, and no one can deny that. But historically, just pulling back a little bit and looking, it's not uncommon for someone who wins in that way to get a bump in the polls, because people see action, they have a feeling of hope, and there's generally an upbeat, persona around them at that time. So I'm not wary, but I guess I'm just looking at it from a historical point of view.
Well, I think for Malcolm Turnbull, yes, this is all positive, and yes, there is a pattern. New leaders get the benefit of the doubt. The voting public, or those who are surveyed, give a more favourable view. What Malcolm Turnbull might do with that remains to be seen. I think one option that he has is to say, okay, well, the polls are going very strongly in my favour. Everybody's happy. Let's have an early election. Let's have a double dissolution. There are a number of factors that might push him in that direction, one of which is the way in which the minor parties did not fare very well in Canning, that the Greens dropped a little bit, and the voters tended to come back to the 2 major groupings, the coalition, well, in this case the Liberal Party in Canning, and the Labor Party. So there might be a temptation to say, well, maybe the tide with the minor parties is turning, that people are coming back to the 2 major parties.
Is that in the idea of getting more favourable numbers in the Senate so that he could get his agenda through?
Well, I think that could be part of the thinking.
Okay.
However, that's one scenario. I suspect that's probably a high-risk scenario, because there's the risk of a backlash from the voting public about going to the elections not quite a year early. I suspect that Malcolm Turnbull will weigh that up and come down more in the side of, let me build my position as Prime Minister and leader, let me establish the government as competent, as effective, as unobtrusive as possible, so that people are no longer seeing the sorts of things that they've seen for the past couple of years. There are a couple of big bridges that Malcolm Turnbull will probably need to mend around some of the policy fiascos of the former government, of the former Abbott-led government, but I think his strategy will be more steady as she goes, making small advances, getting small bits of policy in place in preparation for taking bigger agendas to the election in 2016. That way he can build the support both within the party and the coalition, and maybe
shore up his leadership, really.
But strengthen the leadership, because there are a few cracks underneath there, and the Nationals are not particularly...
Well, they've been done in a place in cabinet, haven't they?
They claim they have. Yeah. I think they believe that their entitlement and power should be greater than perhaps it is. They're not even absolutely necessary for Malcolm Turnbull to manage, shall we say, in the lower house. He's got a pretty reasonable majority. I mean, yes, the Nationals are sort of needed, but their relevance in some respects to the voting public, at least in where the most of the public live,
the urban centres, yes,
in the rural areas. And one raises an eyebrow that the water resources went to the leader of the Nationals Party, not the leader of the National Party, Barnaby Joyce. And this is a very crucial area for Australia that it seems that I'm not sure whether Barnaby Joyce yet has the national agenda firmly on his sights, or whether he has particularly a sectional interest, i.e. looking after the farmers, which is only one part of the problem with the water resource issue, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is a really crucial part of Australia's agricultural effort. And it's a bit of a worry given some of his past comments.
We're chatting with Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor in Politics at the University of Newcastle. Just briefly and in closing, what do you make of this new look cabinet, Jim?
Well, I'll try to be brief. It's a clever cabinet. It's a clever ministerial reshuffle. He's rewarded, quite obviously, he's rewarded some of his supporters. He's rewarded some of his enemies by holding some of them in key positions.
Is that the old truism, keep your enemies close, your friends close and your enemies closer?
Yes, I'm not quite sure how the term enemy applies in some respects, but certainly those who didn't support him, he's given some rewards to. Some of those who didn't support him, he's sacked or relegated, and he's elevated a number of junior members of Parliament into the full ministry. I think there are 8 women now in the ministry. Some of that is simply terminological in the sense that they were parliamentary secretaries or very junior ministers. They're now all to be called ministers, even if they're an assistant or whatever. So they're all to be called a minister, which means that there are now 8 women in the ministry, and he'll be able to make some mileage out of that. And I think that the other dimension is that he's shown, shall we say, he's reinvigorated, I think people are talking about. He's renovated the cabinet in such a way that people can see some meaningful change and some reasonable change. It's not simply a matter of putting the favoured few into the favoured positions, and the boys' club or the ministers' club goes on as before. I think he sent a very strong signal that we are making changes, and the ministry that I have now selected and moved around is going to be an effective ministry, and it's not going to be, shall we say, subject to captain's picks, in the sense that we're going to have considered policy rather than policy on the run or what happens to be expedient. And I think that we'll see a different style of leadership from Malcolm Turnbull.
More conciliatory, I would imagine. Dr. Jim Joes, thank you. We will talk more. There's going to be lots to talk about, I see, in the coming months, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
My pleasure, Meryl.
Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Newcastle, 2NURFM.